October is the month most gardeners give up. The tomatoes are finished, the beans have stalled, and the temptation is to pull everything out, till the bed under, and wait for spring like the season is already over. But while your neighbors are winterizing their tools and calling it quits, you could be running one of the most productive stretches of the entire year, a month where more than a dozen crops keep filling your kitchen while everyone else's garden goes silent. And the cost of giving up early is bigger than it looks. A bag of pre-washed greens runs close to $4 at the store in December, a single daikon radish close to $2, and most of that expense is simply the price of not knowing which plants were built for exactly this weather. The difference between an empty bed in October and a full one has nothing to do with luck, a warmer yard, or a greenhouse. It comes down to knowing which crops don't stop when the weather turns, which ones are only just getting started, and which ones you should have already put in the ground months ago. Here are the crops that keep your garden producing straight through October and deep into the coldest months of the year. Number 1. Kale. Kale planted in midsummer hits its peak flavor in October because frost converts the starches stored in the leaves into sugar, which means the same plant that tasted slightly bitter in August turns sweet and tender the moment the temperature drops into the low 30s. Most gardeners think frost ends the kale harvest. In reality, it's the point where kale finally becomes worth eating, and the flavor only keeps improving as the nights get colder. Keep harvesting the outer leaves and leave the growing tip alone, never taking more than a third of the plant at once, and a single planting will keep feeding you weekly from October through the first hard freeze, and often well beyond it under nothing more than a sheet of frost cloth. Number 2. Swiss chard. Chard behaves like kale's tougher, thicker-skinned cousin, shrugging off light frost while continuing to push out new leaves from the same root system it grew all summer. And because chard stores moisture in its thick, ribbed stems rather than thin leaf tissue, it tolerates dry cold far better than lettuce or spinach ever could, often outlasting both by several weeks. Cut the outer stalks close to the base with a sharp knife. Leave the center crown untouched so it keeps generating new growth, and the plant will keep resupplying you every 10 to 14 days until temperatures fall into the low 20s, at which point a simple cloche will buy you another month. Number 3. Collards. Collards are, if anything, more cold-hardy than kale, tolerating temperatures well into the low 20s without visible damage, and like kale, a touch of frost sweetens them rather than damaging them. The real advantage is volume. A single collard plant produces broad, heavy leaves the size of dinner plates that can feed a family from one harvest, which makes it one of the most calorie-efficient greens you can grow this late in the season, especially compared to the smaller yields you'd get from lettuce or spring greens. Harvest from the bottom up, always leaving the top rosette intact, and the plant will keep growing new leaves faster than you can eat the old ones, often for 8 to 10 weeks straight. Number 4. Leeks. If you planted leeks back in spring, October is where all that patience finally pays off. Unlike almost anything else in the garden, leeks don't need to be harvested before winter. They simply stand in the ground, thickening slowly as the weather cools, and you pull them exactly when you need them rather than racing to preserve them before they spoil. A thick mulch of straw around the base protects the shafts from repeated hard freezing, and a bed of overwintering leeks is effectively a root cellar that requires no shelf space, no electricity, and no attention beyond a shovel and a cold afternoon. And here's why these first 4 crops matter more than you'd think. Kale, chard, collards, and leeks aren't leftovers from summer limping toward frost. They're plants that don't just survive October, they use it, converting the exact conditions that kill off everything else into better flavor and steadier growth. They're the difference between a garden that quietly shuts down for 6 months and one that keeps a family fed straight through the first real snow without a single extra seed sown. Number 5. Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are famous for being slow, taking upward of 100 days from transplant to harvest, and that slowness is exactly why they belong in an October garden instead of a summer one. The sprouts that formed in the leaf joints all season stay tight and bitter in warm weather, but once frost hits, the same chemical conversion that sweetens kale sweetens Brussels sprouts, turning them from an afterthought into the best vegetable on the plate. Snap the lowest sprouts off first, working your way up the stalk as the upper ones continue to mature and swell, and a single plant, left standing through several frosts, can keep producing for 6 to 8 weeks straight, often into December. Number 6. Winter radishes. Forget the small, fast salad radishes you grew in spring, the ones that turn spongy and hot within a week of maturing. Daikon and other winter radish varieties are sown in late summer specifically to bulk up through October, growing roots the size of a forearm that store sugars instead of losing them to heat stress. Sow them thickly, thin to 6 inches apart, once they've sprouted, and let them sit in the ground even after the tops die back. Because unlike spring radishes, the cold only improves their flavor, their texture, and their ability to store for weeks in a root cellar or even a cool garage. Number 7. Turnips. Turnips sown in August or early September are built for exactly this moment, producing both a root crop and a green crop from the same planting. The greens can be cut continuously without harming the root below, which means a single bed gives you 2 harvests running in parallel through the entire month. Once the roots reach 2 to 3 inches across, they can stay in the ground under a thick layer of mulch for weeks past that point without turning woody or bitter, giving you a standing harvest you can draw from whenever the kitchen needs it. Number 8. Spinach. Fall-sown spinach behaves nothing like the spinach you grew in spring. Instead of bolting the moment it warms up, it grows slowly and steadily through cool weather, building thick, dark leaves that hold their quality and their nutrient density far longer than a summer crop ever could, since the plant isn't racing against heat to flower before it dies. Left in place under even a thin layer of row cover, October spinach will often survive into winter dormant but alive, then resume growing again in late February, giving you a harvest window most gardeners assume is impossible without a heated greenhouse. Number 9. Parsnips. Parsnips are one of the strangest crops in the garden because they're actively unpleasant to eat if you dig them too early, and genuinely excellent if you leave them alone. The starches inside the root don't convert to sugar until the ground has gone through several hard frosts, which means the exact weather that ends most root crops is the weather that finally makes parsnips worth harvesting. Leave them in place under a heavy layer of mulch once the tops die back, and you can dig them straight out of frozen ground all winter, one meal at a time, with a flavor no spring-dug parsnip ever matches. That's 9 crops now, and here's the pattern worth noticing. None of them are new plantings you're rushing to start in a panic as the weather turns. They're crops already sown by summer, quietly waiting in the ground for the exact conditions most gardeners think signal the end of the season, when really it's just the beginning of a different one. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the next 4 aren't about salvaging what's already growing in the garden right now. They're about the head start almost no one takes, the kind of planning that puts you months ahead of anyone still thinking about the garden in the past tense. Number 10. Mâche. Also called corn salad, mâche is sown directly into the ground in early autumn, specifically because it germinates best in cool soil and actually struggles in summer heat. It forms small, tender rosettes that sit tight to the ground, shrugging off frost that would destroy lettuce, and it keeps growing slowly all winter under nothing more than a cold frame or a sheet of row cover. By the time other gardeners are still waiting for their seed catalogs to arrive, you'll already be harvesting fresh salad greens that cost nothing and took 5 minutes to plant. Number 11. Garlic. October is the classic planting window for garlic in most climates because the cloves need several weeks of root growth before the ground freezes, without producing top growth that would only be killed off by winter. Break a bulb into individual cloves, plant them root down and pointed end up about 2 inches deep and 6 inches apart, mulch heavily with straw, and walk away until spring. What looks like an empty bed all winter is actually the most productive square footage in your entire garden, because that one October planting turns into next summer's entire garlic supply. Number 12. Cabbage. Late-planted cabbage varieties bred for cold tolerance will sit in the garden through October, holding in near-perfect condition far longer than a summer cabbage ever could, because cool weather slows the bolting and splitting that ruins heads in the heat. A frost or two only firms the head further. Harvest by cutting at the base once the head feels solid when squeezed, and leave the outer leaves and root in place, because many varieties will send up smaller secondary heads from the same stump before the season fully ends. Number 13. Carrots. Carrots sown in midsummer for a fall harvest go through the exact same frost-triggered sugar conversion as parsnips, which is why a carrot pulled in October tastes noticeably sweeter than one pulled in July from the same variety. Left in the ground under a foot of loose straw or shredded leaves, carrots can be dug straight out of the soil all winter long, one meal at a time, staying fresher and crisper than anything you could pull, wash, and store in a refrigerator drawer for months. And here's the technique that makes every single one of these crops perform even better. A cold frame or a length of row cover fabric strung over hoops costs less than $20 to build, and it raises the temperature underneath by several degrees while blocking the wind that does most of the real damage to cold-hardy plants. It isn't heating the garden, it's simply removing the two things that stress a plant faster than cold ever does, which means the same crops that already tolerate frost will keep growing weeks longer, and the ones sitting right at their limit will suddenly have room to spare. 13 crops in, and here's the insight that separates a garden that dies in October from one that keeps feeding a family straight through winter. Every plant on this list was already growing, or already in the ground, before the first frost ever showed up. None of them required a greenhouse, a heated propagator, or a lucky microclimate, and none of them cost more than the price of a seed packet and a bag of mulch. They required only one thing: planting on a calendar that ignores the assumption that the growing season ends when summer does. Most gardeners treat October as cleanup month, the point where you accept defeat, clear the beds, and start dreaming about next April while the grocery bill quietly climbs back up to what it was before the garden ever existed. But the gardeners who actually eat from their own soil in December, January, and February are the ones who understood back in July and August that cold isn't the enemy of a garden. Neglect is. A frost doesn't end a harvest. It sweetens one if you planted the right thing early enough to let it, and it exposes exactly who did the work months ago and who's improvising too late to matter. That's the real difference between a garden that goes silent for half the year and one that keeps producing right through the coldest months. Not a warmer climate, not more space, not more work, and not a single extra dollar spent on equipment or heating. Just the decision, made months in advance, not to let October be the end of anything. The empty bed in your neighbor's yard and the full one in yours were planted the exact same week, in the exact same weather. The only difference was which of you believed the season was already over.